Egypt, even if you accept the conventional timeline of Egypt, which is 2500 BC for the Great Pyramid, go look at the rest of the world at 2500 BC. You don't see anything like that. Nothing even close.
Ancient Egyptians were masters of burial. They built mountains of stone to protect their pharaohs. But one secret was buried even deeper. Far beneath the pyramids, a team hunting for lost tunnels found a staircase descending into the earth. It led them to a chamber, a massive underground lake. Floating on the still black water was a sight that shouldn't exist, a huge stone coffin, perfectly buoyant. This discovery has left Egyptologists speechless. It's not a tomb, it's a paradox. And the moment they touched it, they realized it was a terrible mistake. Giza's sunken secret. For thousands of years, the Giza Plateau was considered the most explored, mapped, and understood archaeological site on Earth. Everyone's obsessed with the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, and the Valley of the Kings. Experts wrote the book on ancient Egypt. The crazy part is, they were wrong. They had only scratched the surface. It all started with strange readings. A joint team of Egyptian and French archaeologists was using new ground-penetrating radar technology to map the bedrock beneath the plateau. They were hoping to find minor tombs or perhaps some buried workshops. What they found instead made no sense. The radar showed unusual voids, massive empty spaces, and what looked like channels deep below the surface. These weren't small chambers. The readings suggested a massive interconnected structure running for hundreds of yards, almost like a maze. At first, the scientists thought it was an error. Maybe it was an ancient riverbed that had long since dried up, or just a glitch in the expensive equipment. But here's the catch. The data kept repeating the same impossible pattern. It wasn't natural. The shapes were too precise, the angles too sharp. This was man-made. The local stories, long dismissed by serious academics, suddenly seemed less like myths. For generations, local Bedouins had passed down tales of an underground world beneath Giza, a labyrinth of the gods where the ancient kings supposedly stored their most powerful and dangerous secrets. For years, researchers wrote this off as folklore. Ancient people loved to mix fantasy with history. But when the radar scans started to confirm the impossible, even the biggest skeptics on the team grew quiet. The excavation began in secret. They chose a spot away from the tourist paths near a lesser-known mastaba. The team expected to dig down and find a few old tunnels or forgotten chambers. They were not prepared for what they actually found. After digging through 20 feet of sand and debris, they hit solid bedrock, and carved directly into it was a staircase. It was narrow, steep, and descended into total darkness. The air that rose from it was cold and musty, carrying a smell of damp stone and something else, something metallic. It was clear that no one had set foot there for thousands of years. The steps were perfectly preserved, showing no signs of wear. After days of clearing the entrance and setting up lights, the team began their descent. The deeper they went, the colder and quieter it became. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water echoing from somewhere unseen. This was not a tomb. It felt different. It felt like a pathway to somewhere else. They reached a long stone corridor, over 100 yards long. The walls were impossibly smooth, polished like glass, and they were lined with carvings, but not the hieroglyphs they were used to. These were older, simpler, yet strangely powerful. Torchlight danced across the markings, revealing massive shapes of serpents, staring eyes, and symbols that looked like flowing water or waves. A nervous joke was made that maybe this was where the Nile began. The laughter didn't last. The corridor led them to a sealed door. Not wood, but a solid slab of black granite, heavier than anything they had ever seen underground. It took the team 3 full days of careful work to drill a small hole and figure out how to open it without damaging the structure. When the final block was moved and the seal was broken, a gust of stale, cold air burst out, making the team's lights flicker. Behind that door was a cavern. It was massive. The beams of their flashlights couldn't even find the walls. The ceiling shimmered faintly, as if coated in quartz crystals, reflecting their light like a dim galaxy. At first they thought the floor was made of polished obsidian, but when one of the crew dropped a small tool, it wasn't a clank, it was a splash. It wasn't stone, it was water, a lake, a massive underground lake. No one spoke for a full minute. Lakes didn't exist beneath Giza. This wasn't natural. The water was impossibly still, black as ink, and it stretched into the darkness as far as their lights could reach. But what most people don't realize is that the lake wasn't the discovery that shook them. It was what was on the lake. There, drifting silently in the exact center, was a stone coffin. A sarcophagus, massive, perfectly rectangular, made of dark, glistening basalt. It wasn't resting on a platform or held up by hidden pillars. It was floating. Perfectly balanced, it bobbed gently in the ripples their arrival had made. The team was stunned. This was a complete paradox. How could a stone coffin weighing several tons possibly float? Was the water incredibly dense with salt or minerals? Was there something beneath it holding it up? One archaeologist whispered that it looked like a vessel for the afterlife, meant to carry someone across the dark waters of eternity. They set up a base camp at the edge of the lake, documenting everything. The air smelled faintly of minerals, but there was that other smell too, that sharp metallic tang, like old copper or rust. Their instruments started picking up faint energy readings, almost like a magnetic pulse, centered on the coffin. Some of the team tried to laugh it off, blaming the damp air or equipment malfunction. Others weren't so sure. The carvings in the cavern, the ones that looked like water, now made terrifying sense. They seemed to tell a story, or maybe a warning. They showed scenes of men carrying torches, walking toward the water, followed by massive waves swallowing them whole. There were figures of jackals and serpents, all facing inward, guarding something in the center. One inscription, barely visible near the shore, was roughly translated. It read, "The one who sleeps beneath the water must not be disturbed." The team leader, Dr. Karim, tried to dismiss the idea of curses. He was a man of science. Still, he had to admit that the sheer scale of the engineering and entire underground lake suggested something far beyond a normal tomb. The deeper they explored the edges of the cavern, the stranger it got. They found tunnels leading away from the lake, narrow, winding, and branching out like veins in the rock. Some ended in solid stone, others in collapsed chambers filled with mud. The labyrinth was real. As they prepared to take samples and send in divers, one of the technicians reported something new. The lake's temperature was unusually warm, almost as if something beneath it was generating heat. A diver, checking his gear, confirmed it, but he added one more detail that made everyone's blood run cold. The heat wasn't constant. It was rhythmic. The readings pulsed like a slow, sleeping heartbeat, but the coffin itself held an even more impossible secret. A warning in an unknown language. The team camped beside that black underground lake for 3 nights before daring to touch the coffin. The sheer impossibility of it kept them cautious. They had to bring in more lights, specialized diving gear, and heavy recording equipment. Every scientist in the group knew one basic fact. A solid block of basalt, which this coffin appeared to be, is about 3 times denser than water. It should have plunged to the bottom like an anchor. Yet, there it was, resting on the surface like it was made of balsa wood. They had to explain it scientifically. The first theory was that the lake was a kind of super-dense brine, like the Dead Sea. But water samples came back. Strange. It was mostly fresh water, but with trace minerals they couldn't immediately identify. And get this, the density was nowhere near high enough to float a multi-ton block of stone. The next theory, an unseen platform. Divers were sent in. The water was cold despite the rhythmic heat pulse from the center. Their lights cut through the blackness, but they couldn't find the bottom. The lake was deeper than any of their instruments could measure, and beneath the floating coffin, there was nothing. Just dark, endless water. It was floating entirely on its own. As the divers circled the sarcophagus, they noticed it was sealed tight, not with mortar, but with a dark, resin-like substance that was cool to the touch. There were no cracks, no damage. Its surface was covered in those same strange markings from the tunnel, but here they were more complex. They weren't traditional hieroglyphs. They were deep, precise carvings that looked more like geometric equations or runes. The design was elegant but deeply unsettling, with spirals and eye-like patterns that seemed to follow the light. Dr. Karim and his assistant Nadia spent hours taking rubbings and high-resolution photos of the markings. They sent the images back to the surface, to experts in Cairo and Berlin. The responses that came back were confused and in some cases alarmed. Some said the symbols had a passing resemblance to early pre-dynastic scripts, writing that existed before the first pharaohs, thousands of years earlier than believed. Others thought it looked closer to Sumerian. One world-renowned linguist sent back a blunt, chilling message. The symbols were not Egyptian. They were not from any known human culture. That single sentence changed the entire project. If this coffin wasn't Egyptian, what was it doing buried beneath Giza? How old was it? And who or what had the technology to build an artificial lake and float a stone box on it thousands of years before the pyramids? The divers reported another disturbing finding. Whenever they swam close to the coffin, their equipment went haywire. Digital cameras would flicker and die, their comms filled with static. The dive lights would dim as if the water itself was drinking the light, and the water itself seemed to vibrate. It was a low, invisible hum that they could feel in their bones. One diver, a hardened military veteran, surfaced early, visibly shaken. He reported feeling an intense pressure in his chest as he got near it, as though the air was being squeezed from his lungs. Dr. Karim was now facing a choice. Every logical part of his brain told him to pull the team, seal the entrance, and report this to the highest levels of government. But his curiosity, the thing that makes someone an explorer, had taken over. They had stumbled onto the greatest mystery of the century. Whatever was inside that coffin could rewrite history. The plan was simple. They couldn't move it. So they would open it where it was. Using a portable crane assembled in the cavern, they gently attached harnesses around the massive lid. The operation was tense. The team was silent. As the crane's motor whined, the water around the coffin didn't just ripple. It seemed to pull away from the stone as if it was afraid of it. With a horrible grinding sound of stone on stone, the lid cracked open. Just an inch. The smell that escaped was like nothing they had ever encountered. It wasn't the smell of decay or ancient dust. It was sharp, metallic, and electric, like ozone after a lightning strike. It burned their noses and made their eyes water. They angled their lights into the gap. The inside was lined with that same dark, shiny resin which seemed to be coating something. At first it looked empty, just a dark, glistening interior. But as they leaned closer, they saw shapes, delicate and pale, suspended in the resin like insects in amber. Bones. But they weren't human, and they weren't animal. They were too long, too thin. The joints were all wrong. The skull, just visible, was elongated and tapered. Dr. Karim called for photos, for samples, for anything. But before a single sample could be taken, the entire chamber reacted. The temperature, which had been cool, began to rise, fast. A thermometer went from 68 degrees to 85 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a minute. The instruments that had been glitching now went crazy, needles spiking into the red. The water of the lake, once still, began to ripple violently. The coffin started to rock. A deep rumbling sound echoed from the tunnels, and the low hum they'd felt earlier exploded into a deafening, vibrating tone. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the cavern ceiling. The quartz crystals above them lit up, flashing in time with the pulse, turning the cavern into a Type Tehe cavern into a chaotic storm of light. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The hum vanished. The ripples faded. Silence, heavy and absolute, returned. When they checked the instruments, everything was dead, flatlined. The energy spikes were gone. The water was still. It was as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The carvings on the coffin lid, the ones that were just stone before, now had a faint, sickly green glow. Nadia, watching intently, was certain she saw one of the symbols move, twisting like a snake before settling back into the stone. Dr. Karim ordered everyone out. Now! They left in a hurry, but what they found when they returned was even worse. The vanishing entrance. When the team returned at dawn, they were armed with heavier gear, backup power, and a new plan. They expected to find everything as they had left it. The same quiet chamber, the same still black water, and the same terrifying coffin. But the moment they descended the final step of the staircase, they knew something was wrong. The air was different. It was heavy, colder than the day before, and the metallic scent was so thick it was almost suffocating. Their high-powered lamps flickered on and the entire team froze in disbelief. The chamber wasn't the same. The underground lake was still there, its surface like a sheet of black glass. But the walls were no longer bare rock. Overnight, they had become covered in new carvings, thousands of them. The symbols matched the strange, spiraling script from the coffin, etched into the stone as if they had always been there. It was as if the walls themselves had woken up and decided to rewrite their own story. Everywhere they looked, something was off. The high-tech equipment they had left neatly arranged at their base camp was now scattered, thrown across the shore. Cameras on heavy tripods were toppled, their lenses cracked. The generator was silent, its fuel line neatly severed. And one of their field notebooks, the one Nadia had been using to sketch the symbols, was gone. Then came the realization that made Dr. Kareem's stomach drop. The coffin. It was no longer in the center of the lake. It had drifted silently in the night. It was now floating just 10 feet from the shore, close enough to touch. Its massive stone surface was glistening with water, and faint rings rippled outward from it as if something had just disturbed it. Despite the rising panic, the team's training kicked in. They began documenting. Photos, video, measurements, anything to prove what they were seeing. But something else was wrong. The acoustics of the cavern had changed. Their voices didn't echo. The sound was flat, dead, as if the space had somehow shrunk. Laser measurements confirmed their fears. The ceiling was lower, by nearly 3 feet, and the distance between the walls had shifted. The chamber was, impossibly, rearranging itself. That's when one of the researchers spotted it. Near the shore, half buried in the damp sand, was the missing notebook. It was soaked. Nadia rushed over and picked it up. She flipped to the last page, which she had left blank. It wasn't blank anymore. The page was covered in fresh writing, the same spiraling, non-human script from the coffin. The ink? It wasn't ink. It was a dark, resinous substance, still wet, that shimmered under the flashlight. No one could read it, but everyone there understood its intent. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. Dr. Kareem made the call. "We are sealing this tomb." Now. The project was over. They would withdraw, report their findings, and let the authorities handle it. But before leaving, a geologist on the team attempted one final measurement. He lowered a weighted probe into the lake to find the bottom. The probe sank for about 50 feet and then stopped. Abruptly. This was far shallower than the bottomless readings from before. When he pulled the probe back up, its metal tip was coated in a thick, tar-like substance. As they watched, the substance twisted on its own, then hardened into a brittle black resin. The divers flat out refused to go back in the water. They insisted the lake was alive, that you could feel it breathing. That night, the team set up motion sensors and audio recorders at the entrance, hoping to get some proof of what was happening. When they checked the recordings the next morning, every single device had shut off at precisely 3:03 a.m. The final frame of video, just before the camera died, captured two things: faint, new ripples on the lake and what looked like a single, wet, five-fingered handprint forming on the stone beside it. Fear finally replaced curiosity. The team fled, planning to dynamite the staircase. As they gathered their gear, a low vibration began to pulse through the rock. The water trembled. The lights flickered. The hum returned, growing louder, deeper, until it was a physical pressure in their chests. Then, without warning, it stopped, and it was replaced by something else. A voice. It was faint, distant, and heavy, echoing from the tunnels and seemingly from the water itself. It was like a whisper made of grinding stones. It wasn't a language they could understand, but it had rhythm. Slow, deliberate, almost like a chant. The team didn't walk. They ran. They scrambled up the staircase, the vibration shaking the stones beneath their feet. Just before reaching the surface, one of their flashlights tumbled from a pack, bouncing down the steps. Its beams swung wildly, catching the lake one last time. The surface, once black, was now glowing. A soft, pulsing, toxic blue light was shining up from the depths. When they returned the next day with officials ready to seal the entrance, it was gone. The entire passage had collapsed. The staircase, the corridor, the granite door, all of it was buried under thousands of tons of rock. The desert had reclaimed its secret. But whatever was in that lake wasn't done. It had just found a new way to reach out. The government cover-up. For a few days, the team tried to rationalize what they had seen. They were scientists after all. Maybe it was a release of subterranean gas. Maybe the voice was just the rock settling. Maybe the stress and low oxygen had caused a group hallucination. But back on the surface, under the hot Egyptian sun, the strangeness continued. It started small. The ground near the collapsed excavation site began to shift. Not in a dangerous way, but almost like the sand was breathing. Equipment left near the sealed entrance, like generators and heavy tools, would disappear overnight. They were later found half-buried miles away in the desert, as if something had dragged them and then discarded them. The local Bedouins, who had been wary before, now refused to come within a mile of the site. They said the animals were afraid. And get this, they were right. Flocks of desert birds, which normally flew over the plateau, would now make sharp, unnatural turns, avoiding the area as if hitting an invisible wall. At first, Dr. Karim refused to connect these new events to the floating coffin. He blamed the shifting sands, electrical interference, anything logical. But then, when reviewing old drone footage of the Giza plateau, he saw something. Faint, geometric shapes in the sand, forming and fading over time. Perfect circles. Concentric rings. They looked eerily exactly like the spiral patterns carved on the coffin. The discovery and the team's panicked report spread quietly through the archaeology community. The official response from Cairo was swift and total. The site was declared a national security risk and sealed indefinitely, citing structural instability. But not everyone was convinced. Rumors began to spread of a containment operation. Locals reported seeing unmarked military trucks driving to the site at night. Some claimed engineers were pouring thousands of tons of concrete into the collapsed shaft. Meanwhile, the team members themselves began to experience after effects. Several reported intense recurring nightmares, migraines, a constant feeling of nausea. Nadia's sketches, which she had recovered, seemed to change. Lines that had been faint stone carvings now glowed under a black light. When a sound engineer analyzed the patterns, he found they matched sound frequencies. The carvings weren't just a warning, they were a recording of the voice they heard in the cavern. Then came the tremors. A month after the chamber collapsed, small earthquakes rippled through the Giza region. This is highly unusual for the area. Seismologists were puzzled. The quakes weren't random. They occurred in repeating intervals. A short burst, a long pause, two short bursts. It was rhythmic. It was the same rhythm as the heat pulse from the lake, the same rhythm as the chant. Dr. Karim, now working in secret, begged his contacts at Cairo University to re-examine the seismic data. They did. And the truth was undeniable. The pulse was still there. Something was still moving, still beating deep beneath the ground. Satellite imaging showed what they all feared. The ground directly over the buried chamber was sinking, as if the void beneath was growing. And when they compared these new scans to the old radar maps, they found a new anomaly. A new, larger void had appeared, even deeper below the original chamber. The labyrinth was growing. When a small part of the story leaked to the press, it was immediately dismissed as an internet hoax, just another wild pyramid conspiracy theory. But those who had been there, those who had smelled the ozone and heard the chant, they knew better. Nadia began keeping a journal of her nightmares. Each night she saw the same thing, the coffin, floating on a black lake, surrounded by walls that pulsed like a living heart. And each morning, she woke up to find a fine layer of sand on her apartment floor, even though the windows were sealed. The most terrifying part? A few weeks later, a sudden violent sandstorm swept across Giza. It was fierce, blinding, and completely unnatural, with a strange red dust. It lasted for 3 full days. When it finally cleared the entire dig site, the military fences, the concrete cap, everything was gone. Buried under a new, massive dune. And when the seismologists checked their instruments, the rhythmic vibrations had stopped. Whatever was down there had finally gone silent. Or perhaps it had just moved. The silence was terrifying, but what they found years later was the real nightmare. What are they hiding? When the sands of Giza finally settled, the story of the floating coffin was buried, both literally and politically. The Egyptian government shut down all discussion. The official story was that Dr. Karim's team had hit a natural unstable cavern, and their report was a mixture of stress-induced fantasy and seismic anomalies. To the world, the incident was over, but in science, a mystery is never truly over. Years later, a new small team of researchers at the University of Alexandria began re-examining geological scans of the plateau. Their project was boring on paper: to create a new 3D model for conservation. They had no connection to the old dig. They weren't looking for a mystery. But their new high-powered software stitched all the old radar data together. And it found something. Deep beneath the plateau, far below the original collapsed chamber, there was another cavity. Unlike a natural cave, this one had perfect symmetrical walls. And in the very center of that void, the radar showed a dense rectangular object. It was almost identical in size to the floating coffin. They thought it was a ghost in the data, just an echo of the first find. But they ran the scans again and again. The shape persisted. The anomaly was real. There was a second one. This news leaked, not to the press, but through encrypted messages between academics. A few remembered what happened to Dr. Karim, but in 2023, under the guise of a geological survey, the Alexandria team quietly began drilling a narrow borehole far from the original site. They expected to hit limestone. At around 120 feet down, the drill hit a layer of black stone. It was impossibly smooth, cold, and harder than granite. The drill bit, a diamond-tipped head, was destroyed. When they lowered a probe camera, they saw it. Carvings. Not Egyptian, and not the spiral script from the first coffin. These were older, more primitive. They looked like the ancient star maps found at Nabta Playa, dating back to 6000 BCE, long before the pharaohs. This is when the story repeats, but worse. The instruments began to fail, magnetic interference spiked, cameras died. But this time, a heat sensor recorded a brief, sudden drop in temperature, not a rise. It was as if something down there was actively absorbing all the energy. The team's funding was cut the next day. Officially, budget reallocation. Unofficially, the Ministry of Antiquities intervened, citing national security. The borehole was filled with concrete. The researchers were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, but one of them, a linguist named Pharaohs, had already copied the data. He sent it to a geophysicist in Europe. The analysis came back a week later with a chilling report. The cavity was emitting faint, rhythmic vibrations, the same low-frequency pulse. But now it was in a pattern. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a signal, like Morse code. And the 3D model of the second coffin? It wasn't sealed. The scan showed one side was slightly open, and just beyond that opening, the radar showed the faint trace of another structure. A corridor. A doorway, leading even further down. So, here's the deal. What is really going on? People who watch videos like this are looking for the truth, for the mystery. But are we missing the key detail? Let's talk down to earth for a second. The skeptical view is easy. This is all credible fiction. It's a combination of natural geology, misidentified radar ghosts, and the overactive imaginations of explorers. The voice was wind in a tunnel. The floating coffin was resting on a hidden ledge. The new carvings were just old ones they missed in the dark. It's a good story, but that's all it is. But then, how do you explain it? How do you explain the same rhythmic pulse being recorded decades apart? How do you explain the unique, non-human symbols? Or the temperature spikes? Or the type or the equipment failures, the shared nightmares, and the government's sudden violent secrecy? So was this an ancient tomb or a prison for something else entirely? Let us know what you believe in the comments. And for more mysteries that have been hidden, make sure to like and subscribe.